Why did no one look up when she walked in? Why, in a room bursting with laughter and pride, did silence cling only to her? The porch light flickered overhead, sputtering like it always had, a twitch in the wiring that no one bothered to fix. She paused at the bottom of the steps, her boots crunching over the gravel in a rhythm too deliberate to be mistaken for accident. For a moment, she hoped the bulb would burn out entirely, leaving her in darkness, unseen, excused from what waited inside. But it held on. It always held on. She opened the door. Warmth wrapped around her like a heavy quilt, but it wasn't welcoming. It was thick, suffocating, laced with cinnamon and glazed ham, laughter bubbling like champagne spilling across polished floors. The dining room glowed with light. A banner stretched across the beams, bright red, white, and blue letters cut sharp against the wood grain. "Welcome home, Lieutenant Ryan." Her brother's name, her brother's title. The table overflowed, faces, voices, clinking glasses. Place cards sat neatly in front of each seat, arranged in tidy order, each a reminder of belonging. Except one. She lingered in the doorway. No one glanced her way. Not her father, leaning in with a grin as he poured another round. Not her brother, polished in his uniform, the collar so stiff it might have cut his throat, a grin stretched like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. Not even her mother until finally, belatedly, her eyes landed on her daughter. Her mother blinked, a flicker of acknowledgement, like someone spotting a shadow where it shouldn't be. Her lips parted just enough to tilt her head toward the porch. "There's a folding chair out back," she said. The look carried more weight than the words. The same look she had given years ago when her daughter came home from the academy with shaking hands and restless eyes. A look that said she was dirt tracked onto a clean floor. She nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then she turned, opened the door again, and let the night air bite her skin. The chair groaned as she dragged it in, metal legs screeching against the tile. She unfolded it at the corner of the table, half inside the circle, half out, like she was a guest in her own bloodline. No one moved to make room. No one stopped mid-sentence. She sat anyway. Glasses lifted. A toast rang out. Her father's voice filled the space thick with pride. To his bravery, his leadership, his future. Her brother's smile deepened. A gracious bow of his head, like he'd been born to soak up applause. And she reached for a water pitcher, poured into an empty glass and swallowed in silence. Her father turned to her once. "Still doing that contracting gig?" he asked, already halfway through his next story before she could answer. A tale about field exercises, about his discipline, his grit. Her aunt leaned across, tipsy, and asked if she was still in that phase where she wore black all the time. She smiled thinly. "Some uniforms don't come in color." Her aunt laughed. She thought it was a joke. The plates piled high, dishes cleared, forks misplaced and fetched again, always by her hands. Precision, quiet, unacknowledged. She moved like she always had, unnoticed, invisible. But behind each motion there was a pulse, something sharp, something she couldn't name. Because the ache wasn't new, but tonight it felt sharp enough to draw blood. No one ever asked why she left the academy, not really. They told stories for her. They filled the gaps with their own myths, that she cracked under pressure, that she wasn't built for command. Her mother blamed her sensitivity. Her father called it weakness, barely said anything at all. But none of them knew. Not what really broke inside her. Not the night she stood in the dorm showers, fully clothed, water pouring over her like she was trying to wash out something invisible, something lodged beneath her skin. And they never knew what happened after. The day she walked into a building without insignia. The day she signed a contract that would never hang in a frame, never sit in never be spoken in daylight. The kind of contract that erased her name from records, burned her ID, deleted her existence like chalk washed from a board. To them she had vanished. And maybe that was easier. Easier than telling them the truth. Easier than watching their faces turn from confusion to fear, from pride to suspicion. So she let them think she quit, let them believe she wasn't strong enough, let them fill her chair with someone else. She carried their silence like a second skin. But in the quiet of her real life, missions whispered, rooms watched, signals tracked, she learned something heavier than combat drills. That strength isn't what people see. Strength is what no one ever sees. Strength is silence. Strength is carrying what can never be spoken. She lifted another plate, cleared another glass, moved like a ghost inside her own family. And still, somewhere under the weight, she felt the faint pulse of who she had become. Not a dropout, not a quitter. Something else, something none of them could name. Later that night, when the laughter had faded into the soft scrape of forks and the muted shuffle of tired feet, she slipped outside. The porch light flickered again, buzzing like it wanted to die but refused to. She leaned against the railing, watching shadows stretch across the gravel drive. For the briefest moment, she closed her eyes, let herself imagine what it might feel like to be seen, to walk inside a room and be recognized, not for medals or speeches, but for surviving things no one else ever knew existed. She exhaled slowly, the breath trembled at the edges. Inside, her brother's voice rose again, smooth, commanding, born for recognition. Her hands clenched around the railing. And for the first time in years, a question formed, sharp, dangerous, and undeniable. What would happen if the truth slipped? If one person, just one, looked past the folding chair, past the silence, and saw her for what she was? The thought scared her, and yet deep down it thrilled her. Because buried in that question was the pulse of something she hadn't felt in years. A possibility. Why did he stand so straight, so proud, while she sat half in shadow? Why was her silence treated as absence when it carried more weight than his medals? The night air stayed with her long after the gathering ended. She walked back to the small room she'd borrowed for the visit, one floorboard creaking under her boots like it wanted to betray her presence. She didn't switch on the lamp. Instead, she sat in the dark, her back pressed against the wall, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant voices fatting behind a closed door. It should have been comforting being home, but home had long ago turned into something else, a stage where she had no lines, a room where her seat was always temporary. Her fingers traced the edge of her duffel bag, packed light as always, essentials only, a habit learned in places where leaving wasn't a choice but an order. She opened the zipper halfway, caught the faint glow of a device buried under shirts. She closed it again quickly, like a reflex. No one here would understand what it was, what it meant, why it hummed faintly even when it looked silent. She leaned her head back against the wall. Her mind replayed the night in fragments, her father's laugh, her mother's tilted glance, his perfect salute to the applause of strangers. None of them remembered the girl who had once outrun him in the yard, the sister who had patched his scraped knees with stolen bandages. They only saw him now, uniformed, applauded, celebrated. And yet somewhere deep, a sharper thought lingered. They didn't just see him. They refused to see her. The ache was familiar, but it wasn't weakness. Not anymore, it was fuel. She stood at dawn. The world outside was still quiet, the streets soft with fog. She walked past neighbors who didn't recognize her anymore, not that they ever really had. She reached the base early, hours before most would arrive, and took a seat in the bleachers where the cold metal bit through her jacket. From there she watched. Recruits lined up in sharp rows, their boots hitting dirt in rhythm, voices strained with discipline. She scanned until she saw him. His posture was squared, his eyes forward, his movements sharp. He looked nothing like the boy who once shouted her name across the playground. He looked like someone rehearsed, trained, molded into the soldier everyone wanted him to be. And then Monroe appeared. Drill Sergeant Monroe. Stocky, thick-voiced, his presence alone bending the air around him. He barked commands that cracked like thunder. His reputation preceded him. Stories whispered in academy halls about the man who could break a cadet with nothing but silence. She sat still, her gaze fixed, and then it happened. Monroe's eyes swept the bleachers, past contractors, parents, civilians with neutral badges clipped to their collars. His gaze landed on her. And froze. For a second, the entire field seemed to stop breathing. His spine straightened, his jaw set. And then, in one motion so sharp it startled the birds from the trees, Monroe turned, snapped to attention, and raised his hand in a salute. "General." The word wasn't shouted, but it cut through the morning air like a blade. Every cadet froze. Silence dropped heavy. A rifle clattered to the ground. His rifle. Her brother's eyes shot wide. His jaw slack, disbelief breaking across his face as though the earth had tilted under his boots. The world hung suspended. She stood, unflinching, raised her hand, returned the salute with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from repetition, from scars, from years spent in places no one here could pronounce. And then, just like that, Monroe nodded, barked for drills to resume, and the world spun forward again. Boots struck dirt, voices rose, but the current had shifted. Whispers flickered through the ranks, eyes darted toward the bleachers, toward her. She sat back down, calm, still, but inside the air was different now. She wasn't invisible anymore, not to them, not to him. His gaze clung to her like a lifeline fraying in his hands. Later, she didn't wait for the end. She slipped out before the crowd thinned, her steps quick, controlled, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. Back in her room, the duffel waited. The device inside vibrated once. A silent signal, red pulsing across the screen. Her breath caught. It had been years since she'd seen that interface. A breach warning, a shadow protocol, something that should have been long buried, scrubbed from existence. She unzipped the bag, pulled it out, fingers moving fast across the keys. The access code blinking on the screen was one she hadn't seen since field work. Retired, dead, burned, and yet here it was, active. Her blood ran cold. It was tied, too. The realization sliced through her. That tracker she'd slipped into his bag years ago, a silent shield, a safeguard he'd never known about, was now triggering alarms. Her mind raced. If Command saw it, he would be flagged. A liability, a leak. Her hands flew across the keys. Silent containment, quarantine, masking. She worked like a surgeon trying to keep a heart alive under impossible odds. Seconds stretched into years. Sweat pricked her spine. Finally, the signal died. The room went still again. And then the door opened. Stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide. In his hand, the device. He stared at her like she was a stranger, like every story told about her had just split open. She cut him off before he spoke. "It's handled." He didn't move, didn't argue, just stared. For the first time in his life, he was seeing her. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was heavy, honest. And for the first time in years, she wasn't sure if she feared it or welcomed it. Why didn't he move? Why didn't he speak? Why did he just stand there in the doorway like the world had split open beneath his boots? The silence was unbearable. She sat at the edge of the narrow bed, the device still glowing faintly in her palm. Its hum was softer now, muted by the layers of code she had thrown over it, but the danger wasn't gone. She could feel it, like smoke seeping under a door, contained for the moment but never truly extinguished. His knuckles were white around the device in his hand. His mouth opened once, then closed, like he couldn't form the words. His eyes darted between her face and the screen, as if searching for a version of his sister that matched either one. Finally he spoke. His voice was thin, strained. "What is this?" Her own voice came quiet, steady. "Something you were never supposed to see." He shook his head, stepping farther into the room, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud. The sound made her chest tighten. The walls felt closer now. His words stumbled, searching. "I don't understand. Why was my name, why was your name on that screen? Why did Monroe, why did he? He broke off, his hand trembling as he lifted the device, almost as if he was afraid it might burn him. General, the word cracked out of him like it didn't belong in his mouth. What does that even mean? You dropped out. You disappeared, you. She cut him off sharp but not unkind. I didn't disappear, I was erased. The words landed like a weight between them. Blinked confusion bleeding into anger. Erased? From what, from who? Her gaze held his, steady, unflinching, but inside her pulse raced. How much could she tell him? How much could he survive knowing? From everything you think you know, she said finally. The silence stretched. His jaw tightened. He looked older in that moment, less the golden boy their family celebrated, more like the boy she used to race across backyards, uncertain, scared, searching. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered. Because I couldn't. Because your safety depended on your ignorance. Because if you knew, they would see you as a weakness in me, and they would use you. The answers crowded her throat but never left her mouth. Instead, she said, because it wasn't your burden to carry. His laugh was hollow, bitter. So you carried it alone, for years, he broke off, shaking his head as though the betrayal was too big to put into words. She wanted to tell him it wasn't betrayal, it was sacrifice, but sacrifice never looks noble to the one left in the dark. She said softly, her voice shifting, breaking just slightly at the edges. If you knew what I've done, what I've had to do, you wouldn't look at me the same, and I couldn't live with that. His eyes locked on hers, sharp, demanding. Then let me decide that. Don't take it from me. The plea in his tone cut deeper than accusation. Her breath caught. For a moment, she saw him not as the soldier, not as the brother, the family, but as the boy who once asked her to keep his secrets, who once trusted her to fight his battles when he couldn't. But this was different. This was life and death. Her hand moved without thinking, reaching for the device in his grip. But he held it tight, resisting. Their fingers pressed together on cold metal, neither willing to let go. Please, she said, her voice barely a whisper now. You have to forget this. Forget what you saw, forget what you heard. His face twisted, pain flickering across his features. How am I supposed to forget that my sister, he swallowed hard, that you're not who we thought you were, that you've been living a life none of us even. He stopped again, his voice cracking. Why didn't you trust me? The question nearly shattered her. She forced herself to meet his eyes, forced herself to say the words she had never admitted aloud. Because trust gets people killed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Grip finally loosened. The device dropped into her palm. She closed her hand around it, feeling its weight, its danger, its inevitability. He sank onto the edge of the bed across from her, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. The posture of a soldier stripped of his certainty. I don't know who you are, he murmured. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say she didn't know anymore either, that the names she had worn, the faces she had borrowed, had blurred into something unrecognizable even to herself. But instead, she said quietly, I'm still your sister. He lifted his head slowly, eyes red, voice raw. Then act like it. The words cut sharper than any accusation. A vibration pulsed through the device in her hand, pulling her back. Another warning. A countdown. The quarantine she'd set was collapsing. Her body went cold. She stood abruptly, moving to the small desk, fingers flying over the keys as she re-engaged protocols, rerouted signals through dead networks buried in corners of the world only she knew. Each keystroke was a lifeline, each command a desperate prayer. Rose behind her, what are you doing? Buying us time, she muttered, not looking back. The screen pulsed again. The signal died, but only temporarily. The breach was still there, waiting, pressing against the edges of her containment like water behind glass. She exhaled slowly, forcing the air out of her lungs. Her hands trembled. stepped closer, his voice lower, now steadier. "Tell me what this means." She hesitated. The words perched on the edge of her tongue like birds ready to scatter. Then, against every instinct she had honed in silence, she gave him one piece of truth. "It means everything I've spent my life protecting is one mistake away from collapse. And right now, that mistake is you." The words landed heavy, cruel in their honesty. His face flinched, but he didn't look away. Instead, he whispered, "Then let me help." For the first time since he entered the room, she faltered. Help from him. The boy-turned soldier whose entire life had been applause and approval, who had never known what it meant to disappear, to burn your name so others could live. Her instinct screamed no, to shield him, to keep him ignorant, to carry it alone. But another voice, softer, buried deep, asked something else. What if this was the moment she wasn't meant to carry it alone? She swallowed hard, turned from the screen and met his gaze. "You don't know what you're asking," she said. "Then show me." The room felt smaller now, heavier, but for the first time in years she didn't feel entirely alone. The device buzzed again, faint, insistent. She silenced it, tucked it back into the duffel and sat down beside him. Her voice was quiet, steady. "There are things I can never tell you, names I can't speak, places I can't describe, but you need to know this much." She hesitated, choosing the words carefully. "Some battles aren't fought on fields, they're fought in shadows, and sometimes the only way to win is to never be known." His jaw clenched, his eyes burned with questions, but he didn't push, not yet. And in that pause, in that fragile silence, something shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of it. Why did the room feel colder than a battlefield? Why did the silence of officers in pressed uniforms weigh heavier than gunfire ever had? The walls were bare, the air sterile. Fluorescent lights hummed faintly above the long table. She sat at one end, her hands still, her posture steady, every breath measured. Across from her sat 3 men and 1 woman, uniforms crisp, expressions unreadable. In front of them, a manila folder, thick, swollen, heavy with implication. Her name printed in clean black ink across the tab. It shouldn't have existed. Her name wasn't supposed to be on any paper. Her record was sealed, erased, buried under layers of clearance most officers would never dream of touching. And yet, here it was, a file thick enough to end her in one stroke. The senior officer cleared his throat. His voice was level but not casual. Every word was chosen with precision. "We've reviewed the breach." Her pulse thudded once hard. "The origin traces back to your clearance path. The system flagged it as active, though records indicate it was retired." She said nothing. Silence was safer than denial. Another officer leaned forward, tapping a pen against the folder. "Your brother's name surfaced in the access chain." Her chest tightened, but her expression didn't change. She forced her body into stillness, the way she'd been trained, breathing shallow, eyes steady, hands quiet. "Explain." The word hung in the air like a blade. She could lie, say it was an error, a glitch, but lies only worked when you could control the evidence, and she couldn't not hear. So she said the one thing that bought time. "I contained it." The woman on the panel lifted her gaze, sharp and probing. "You bypassed the formal review. You rerouted protocols." "Yes." "That action alone is a breach." "Yes." The word cut clean. She gave it without hesitation, admitting what couldn't be. The silence stretched. The panel exchanged glances. The folder sat heavy between them, like a weight pressing the air thinner by the second. Finally, the senior officer leaned back. His voice softened, but not kindly. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" She lifted her eyes, calm, steady. "Do you?" The question startled them. Not in volume, her voice was quiet, but in its defiance. Because she knew something they didn't, something they couldn't. She had kept lives safe. She had carried secrets that would burn entire operations if spoken aloud. She had done the work no one else would claim, in places no one else would survive. And now, she sat in a sterile room being asked to justify the silence that had saved them all. Her mind flickered too, his pale face in the doorway, his trembling hands clutching the device, his whispered question, "Why didn't you trust me?" And she thought this was why, because when truth touched daylight it became a weapon. The panel wasn't finished. One officer tapped the folder again. "There's another matter." He slid a paper out, flipping it toward her. A photograph, her face. Years younger, sharper angles, eyes that hadn't yet learned the discipline of erasure. The officer's voice was measured. "We found traces of your presence on missions that were never formally assigned to you." Her stomach dropped. They had dug deeper than she thought, too deep. The missions weren't official. They were shadows within shadows, requests, off-the-record extractions, assignments no one wanted to acknowledge but everyone depended on. Her face shouldn't have been anywhere, and yet there it was. The woman's voice cut in. "You understand what this means. If this becomes public, every name tied to you becomes vulnerable." Her chest tightened. Jacobs, the names flickered in her mind like ghosts, some alive, some not, all erased, all depending on her silence. She swallowed hard. Her voice came low, steady. "Then it can't become public." The senior officer folded his hands, studying her. "We could restore your record, recognition, rank, official standing. It would resolve questions, protect the integrity of command." Her heart stuttered. Recognition. The very thing she had once dreamed of. A seat at the table. A place not borrowed but given. The chance to be seen, not as an empty chair, not as a dropout, but as someone who mattered. For one breath she let herself imagine it. Applause not stolen but offered. Pride not whispered but declared. But then faces. Jacobs, the team that had walked into silence with her, the people who had trusted her to vanish with them. If she stepped into the light, would their shadows collapse? Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the stillness. "No." The woman tilted her head. "No. No recognition, no ceremony, no restoration." The words landed heavy. The officers exchanged glances again. Confusion, frustration. One of them muttered the word risk. Another wrote something down, his pen scratching sharp across paper. The senior officer finally nodded once, slow, not in agreement but in understanding. "You're choosing silence." She met his gaze. "I always have." The room fell quiet. Her chest felt heavy, but not weak. The kind of heaviness that comes from standing against the tide, from choosing the harder path again and again. When they dismissed her, she walked out into the corridor alone. The air was cooler, freer, though the weight in her chest didn't lift. She moved down the hallway, each step measured, each breath deliberate. At the far end waited, not in uniform, just a plain jacket, hands shoved in pockets, eyes burning with questions. She stopped a few feet away. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence between them carried too much. Finally he asked, low and raw, "What did they say?" She looked at him, really looked. Saw not just the boy he'd been or the soldier he was becoming, but the man caught in between, the man still searching for solid ground. "They gave me a choice," she said softly. "And you?" "I chose them." He frowned. "Them." "The ones you'll never meet, the ones who can't be named." He shook his head, frustration rippling across his face. "You always do this. You always give yourself away for." "For what?" she cut in sharp. "For silence, for shadows, for people who may not even be alive anymore." His voice cracked. "For people who aren't me." The words landed harder than she expected. Her breath caught. She wanted to say no. That everything she had done for him too. That every erased record, every vanished name was another barrier keeping him safe. But safety never feels like love to the one kept in the dark. So instead, she said the only truth she could. For people who trusted me, and I won't betray that trust. He stared at her, eyes burning. Then slowly the fire dimmed, not gone but tempered. He exhaled, long and shaky. And for the first time, he didn't argue. The silence between them shifted again, not empty, not broken, heavy but shared. For her, that was enough. For now, why did the runway feel lonelier than any battlefield? Why did the silence of departure weigh heavier than all the secrets she had carried? The air vibrated with the low growl of engines warming on the tarmac. Dust rose in spirals, catching the pale light of morning. She stood still, bag already stowed, orders sealed inside an envelope tucked deep into her jacket. The transport plane loomed before her like a shadow with wings. Stood a few feet away. No uniform, just a plain jacket, hands shoved into pockets, eyes hollow from a night without sleep. He hadn't asked where she was going. He didn't need to. He knew what departure meant in her world. It meant silence. It meant no calls, no letters, no trace. She adjusted the strap of her pack. "You don't have to stay." "I know." His voice was rough, quieter than usual, "but I am." The words hit her chest harder than she expected. She turned slightly, studying him. The boy who had once begged her to stay up late telling him stories, who had once clung to her hand at the bus stop, now standing taller, older, broken in ways he didn't yet understand. He pulled something from his pocket, a small box. He opened it slowly, almost hesitantly. Inside lay a pin, simple, smooth metal, shaped like a compass needle. She froze. Recognition flared instantly. Not regulation, not issued. A quiet symbol passed between those who chose people over medals, loyalty over ceremony. He held it out. "I don't know everything, maybe I never will, but I know enough now." Her throat tightened. She took the pin gently, feeling its weight, its unspoken meaning. She closed her hand around it, holding it like a secret. Then did something he had never done before. He straightened, lifted his hand, and saluted. Not out of obligation, not because of rank, but out of respect. The gesture cracked something in her chest. She didn't return the salute. Instead, she stepped forward, reached out, and pulled him into a hug. Solid, brief, enough. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. When she stepped back, she saw the question in his eyes, the one he hadn't dared to ask. "When will I see you again?" She had no answer. She turned toward the plane, each step heavier than the last. The metal stairs groaned beneath her boots. She reached the top, paused, and looked back one last time. Stood exactly where she'd left him, one hand resting on his bag, the other hanging at his side, loosely clenched. No audience, no cameras, just him. She turned, stepped inside, and disappeared from view. The cockpit smelled of oil and dust. She buckled in, the harness pressing against her chest like an unspoken reminder of gravity. From her jacket pocket she pulled an old photograph, creased, edges frayed. Her first team, faces blurred by snow and distance, smiles half hidden. On the back, her own handwriting scrawled years ago. "Honor lives in silence, keep walking." She closed her eyes. The engines roared. The plane shook, rising into the air, pulling her away from everything familiar. But peace didn't come with altitude. Her thoughts clung to the look on his face when he saluted, to the weight of the compass pin still in her hand. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure if she had left him behind or brought him with her. Hours blurred. Clouds streaked past the windows. Silence filled the cabin, heavy but not empty. She shifted, restless, her mind circling the breach, the inquiry, the choice she'd made. Recognition, restoration, she could have had it. For once her name could have been spoken with pride. But at what cost? Faces flickered in her memory. Jacobs, ghosts who trusted her to vanish with them, to keep their names safe even if it meant burning her own. She pressed the photograph to her chest. Her voice, though soft, carried conviction. "They won't be forgotten, not while I'm still here." The plane cut through turbulence, a shudder that rattled her bones. She steadied herself, eyes narrowing. Ahead lay another mission, another shadow, another silence. But this time, the silence felt heavier, because now knew. Not everything, not even close, but enough. Enough to change him. Enough to bind them, in ways their family would never understand. When the plane landed hours later, she stepped into a world both familiar and foreign. Sand stung her skin, heat rising in waves off cracked concrete. She moved quickly, her boots finding rhythm without thought. The compound walls loomed high, cameras sweeping in arcs above the gates. Inside, she found the briefing room waiting. Maps stretched across the table, pins marking territories she had already memorized, though the details had shifted. A new operation, a new silence. The commanding officer looked up as she entered. His expression gave nothing away. "You're cleared," he said simply. Cleared, the word echoed. Cleared not because she was innocent, but because she was necessary. She nodded once, slid into her seat and listened. The mission was simple on paper: extraction, neutral zone, in and out, but she knew better. Missions that looked clean on maps always bled when boots hit the ground. Her hand brushed the compass pin in her pocket. She felt its edges, its quiet weight, a reminder, a tether. As the briefing droned on, her mind drifted to, what was he doing now? Did he still see her the way Monroe had, the way the cadets had whispered about? Or was he back at the house, sitting at the crowded table, pretending she was a ghost again? No, she knew him better than that. He had seen her, truly seen her, and once you've seen truth, you can't go back. Her chest ached with the knowledge, because truth was both a gift and a curse. By the time the briefing ended, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the compound. She gathered her gear, her pack heavier than it had been that morning, not from equipment, from weight she couldn't shed. As she prepared to move out, a voice stopped her at the doorway. "You had a chance," the officer said. His tone was neutral, almost curious. "You could take in recognition, a name, a future in the open. Why didn't you?" She paused, turned her head slightly, her profile sharp against the fading light. "Because dignity doesn't speak," she said quietly. "It simply acts." The officer studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, saying nothing more. She stepped into the twilight, her boots crunching against gravel, her shadow stretching long before her. And for the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not pride, not relief. Peace. Heavy, quiet, real. The kind of peace that comes not from applause, but from knowing you stayed true, even when no one was watching, even when they forgot you were ever there. She adjusted her pack, lifted her chin, and kept walking. Because that was all she knew how to do. Why did the desert always feel louder at night? Why did silence in these places carry weight, as though every shadow leaned in to listen? The convoy moved without headlights, engines muffled, tires whispering across dirt. She sat in the back of the lead vehicle, rifle slung low, headset pressed to one ear. The others in the team didn't speak. They knew better. Words carried in the dark. Her eyes scanned the horizon, picking apart the night. The moon hung low, throwing pale light over broken walls and twisted metal. Once this had been a village. Now it was a graveyard of stone and silence. The target was a compound on the far edge. Intelligence said a civilian asset was being held, someone with knowledge too valuable to lose. The kind of mission that wouldn't make headlines but would shape decisions in rooms she'd never enter. She had done dozens like it, but tonight felt different, heavier. Maybe because for the first time in years, someone she loved had looked at her and seen. And now she couldn't shake the thought, what if he was watching her now? What would he see? The convoy halted, engines cut. The team disembarked in silence, boots finding rhythm against dirt. She fell into formation, her body moving with muscle memory sharper than thought. At the perimeter wall, they stopped. She pressed her back against stone still warm from the day's sun. A faint breeze carried sand into her mouth, gritty against her tongue. The team leader signaled. 2 went left, 2 went right. She took the center. The wall loomed high, jagged with broken edges. She pulled herself up, muscles straining, breath steady. At the top, she paused, scanning. The courtyard below was empty, too empty. Her gut tightened. She dropped silently into the dust. Every instinct screamed caution. She raised her rifle, eyes flicking across the shadows. The others followed, fanning out. They moved toward the main building. Its door hung crooked, hinges rusted. She pressed a hand against the wood. Warm, too warm. Her heart thudded once hard. She signaled stop. The team froze. Her other hand slid along the frame. Wires, fine, nearly invisible in the dark. She traced them to a small device tucked beneath the step. Improvised, crude, deadly. She exhaled through her nose. A trap. She gestured retreat, pulling them back into the courtyard. But then, movement. A shadow flickered in the upper window, just for a second, a figure, watching. Her rifle snapped up, sight locking on the dark shape. But before she could fire, it vanished. Her chest tightened. Whoever was inside knew they were here. The mission had changed. The team regrouped. The leader whispered, "Abort." She shook her head, "Not yet." The silence stretched. Finally, he nodded. They circled, finding another entry point, a side door half buried in sand. She crouched, brushed grit from the handle, and tested it. Unlocked. Her breath slowed. She pushed it open. The inside air was thick, stale, smelled of rust and smoke. Shadows swallowed the narrow hallway. They moved in, boots soft against cracked stone. Her rifle tracked corners, doors, empty rooms. Then faint sound. Not words, not movement. Breathing. She froze, lifted a fist. The team stopped. Ahead, a room. Light leaked from the crack beneath the door. She moved forward, slow, careful, until her shoulder touched the frame. She listened. Breathing shallow, fast. She raised 3 fingers. Countdown. 3, 2, 1. She kicked the door open. The room was small, lit by a single lamp. In the corner, a figure sat bound to a chair, face bruised, eyes wide. Civilian, target. Relief pulsed, sharp but brief. She moved quickly, knife-cutting rope, pulling the man to his feet. He sagged against her, too weak to stand. She steadied him, her grip firm, her voice low. "You're safe, we're taking you out." But before the words could settle, gunfire. Explosions tore through the building. The walls shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. The trap hadn't been at the door. It had been everywhere else. Chaos erupted. Bullets shredded the air. The team scattered, returning fire. She dragged the civilian down, covering him with her body, her rifle snapping up to send rounds through the doorway. Figures stormed in, faces covered, weapons flashing. The room filled with smoke and screams. Her chest burned. Her ears rang, but her focus didn't waver. She counted shots, calculated angles, moved with precision. The civilian trembled beneath her, muttering words in a language she barely caught, pleading, praying. She pressed her shoulder against his, grounding him. "Stay down." Minutes stretched like hours. The team held ground, forcing the attackers back. Finally, the gunfire faded. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. Her breath came hard, chest heaving. She scanned the room. 2 teammates wounded, 1 bleeding heavily. She swallowed hard, forcing her voice steady. Extraction now. They moved fast, dragging bodies, carrying the civilian, slipping through smoke and rubble back into the night. Outside, the convoy engines roared back to life. They piled in, dust swallowing them as they sped into the dark. She sat pressed against the wall, rifle across her lap, the civilian leaning against her, trembling. His eyes met hers, filled with gratitude, fear, something she couldn't name. She looked away, staring out the window. The desert rolled by, endless and empty. But inside her chest something twisted. Because she had seen the window, the shadow that vanished, someone had been watching, waiting. This wasn't just a mission, it was a message. And she knew this wasn't over. Hours later, back at the compound, the team rushed the wounded to medics. The civilian was taken for debrief. She stood apart, dust clinging to her jacket, hands still trembling from adrenaline. Her commander approached, expression tight. "You brought him out." Her voice was flat, barely. He studied her, eyes narrowing. "You knew it was a trap." She didn't answer. Because he wasn't asking, he was accusing. And he was right. Her instincts had screamed it from the start. The warmth of the door, the empty courtyard, the shadow in the window. But she hadn't stopped. Why? Because sometimes missions weren't about strategy. They were about choices, about people, about refusing to leave someone behind even when the cost was high. She turned away before he could say more. In her quarters, she sank onto the bed, boots still on, head in her hands. The room spun with echoes of gunfire, the civilians' trembling breath, the weight of lives nearly lost. And beneath it all's voice. "Then let me help." She closed her eyes, pressed her palms into them until stars burst behind her lids. He wanted to help, but help carried weight, and weight crushed. She pulled the compass pin from her pocket, stared at its simple shape, turned it over in her palm again and again, as though it could point her somewhere clearer. But it didn't. It only reminded her that direction came with cost. And she had chosen her path long ago. Why did the silence at home feel heavier than the firefight she had just survived? Why did her brother's questions echo louder than gunfire in her mind? The desert dust still clung to her boots, her jacket, her hair. Even after hours of debriefing, even after washing blood from her hands in water that ran red, then pink, then clear, the weight didn't lift. The mission was marked success. The civilians survived. The wounded were stable. She was alive. And yet, none of it felt like victory. The shadow in the window haunted her. Whoever had been there had let them walk into the trap, which meant someone knew she would come, which meant the breach wasn't just digital anymore, it was personal. She sat on her bunk, the compass pin in her palm, staring at it as though it might whisper answers. Instead, it only reminded her of his salute, his hug, his voice cracking when he asked why she didn't trust him. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she almost let herself imagine what it would be like to tell him everything. To sit across from him, not as the forgotten sister, not as the ghost at the edge of the table, but as the woman who had carried silence like armor for years. But secrets weren't gifts, they were anchors, and anchors dragged. She tucked the pin back into her pocket, rose, and walked into the night air. The compound was quiet. Guards paced the perimeter. Somewhere in the distance, generators hummed. She tilted her face to the stars. They looked the same here as they did at home. That was the part. War didn't change the sky. Back home. She pictured him sitting at that crowded table again, the banner still stretched across the beams, her mother refilling glasses, her father telling stories. Did he still sit when they praised him? Or did his eyes wander toward the empty chair, finally aware of what absence really meant? She hoped he remembered, because forgetting was dangerous. Meanwhile, miles away, did sit at that same table. The banner had been taken down, but the memory lingered in the corners of the room like smoke. His parents laughed, clinked glasses, spoke of his training with pride. His aunt asked if he'd be promoted soon. He nodded when expected, smiled when appropriate, but inside he was somewhere else. He saw her face, steady in the bleachers, heard Monroe's voice, general, felt the weight of the device in his hands, its cold surface burning with truth. And he couldn't go back to ignorance. When his father asked if he'd heard from his sister, he froze. The room quieted. She came to the graduation, didn't she? His mother asked lightly, as though testing a memory she wasn't sure was real. His throat went dry. He thought of the salute, the whispers, the way the air had shifted when Monroe froze mid-stride. "Yes," he said finally. His voice came out steadier than he felt. "She was there." His father frowned, as though the detail didn't matter. "Well, I suppose she had to show up eventually." Clenched his jaw. Show up? She had been there all along, in ways they couldn't begin to imagine. He wanted to say it, to slam his hand on the table and shout that she was more than they ever gave her credit for, that she hadn't quit, hadn't failed, hadn't disappeared, that she was out there right now, carrying the kind of weight none of them could bear. But he didn't, because he wasn't sure how much of the truth was his to tell. So he swallowed the words, let them burn his throat, and stayed quiet. Later, alone in his room, he opened his bag. His hand brushed against the envelope she had slipped into the side pocket. He pulled it out, turned it over. His name written in her hand. He stared at it for a long time. His fingers itched to break the seal, to know what she wanted him to know. But he didn't. Not yet. Because some truths, once opened, could never be folded back into silence. He tucked it away again, heart pounding. Back in the desert, she walked the compound walls, her shadow long under the floodlights. Every step pressed the weight of choices into her chest. Recognition, silence, the breach, the trap. Every thread tangled, pulling with each passing hour. She paused, staring out into the darkness beyond the walls. Somewhere out there, someone was waiting, watching, setting traps. And she knew this wasn't just about missions anymore. It was about exposure. Her silence was cracking. And when silence cracks, lives shatter. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. The mission had ended, but the war, her war, was far from over. And this time, it wasn't just hers to fight. Because had stepped into it now, whether she wanted him to or not. Why did goodbyes always happen without ceremony? Why did the most important moments arrive without warning, without applause, without anyone noticing? The runway shimmered under morning heat. Dust swirled in spirals, caught by the propellers of a waiting transport. Her bag was already stowed. Orders sealed, destination unnamed. Another mission no one would ever speak about. She stood at the base of the stairs, boots planted, shoulders squared. Calm, unflinching. But inside, her chest burned. Because was there. He hadn't dressed for an audience. No uniform, no medals, no posture rehearsed. Just a plain jacket, eyes tired but clear. He carried no banner, no glass of champagne, no family stories about bravery. He carried only the weight of what he now knew. And that was heavier than anything she could give him. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the envelope, the one she had slipped into his bag. Her breath caught. "You thought I'd wait," he said softly, "but I couldn't." He held it out, the seal broken, the paper inside unfolded. I read it. The words struck her like a blade. Her instinct surged, anger, fear, betrayal. That letter wasn't meant for now. It was meant for someday, for when he forgot who he was, for when he needed a compass more than she did. But she swallowed the instinct, let silence fill the space instead. "What did it say?" she asked finally, her voice quiet, steady. His eyes searched hers, steady now, no longer the boy desperate for approval. "It said to remember. That honor isn't in medals or applause, it's in silence, in showing up even when no one sees you." Her chest tightened. He folded the letter again, carefully, tucking it back into his pocket. "I didn't understand it at first, but I think I do now." She wanted to ask how. She wanted to know what he truly saw when he looked at her now. But before she could speak, he reached into his other pocket and pulled out the compass pin. He pressed it into her hand. "This doesn't belong with me, not yet, it belongs with you." The metal was cool against her skin, heavy with meaning. She closed her fist around it, the edges biting into her palm. Straightened, his hand lifted again, a salute. But this time it was different. Not out of duty, not even just respect. It was understanding. Her throat tightened. She didn't return the salute. She stepped forward, closing the space between them, and pulled him into a hug. Quick, solid enough. When she stepped back, she saw it in his eyes. He knew, not everything, never everything, but enough. Enough to carry a piece of her silence with him, enough to never look at her the same way again. She turned toward the stairs. Her boots rang against the metal, each step heavier than the last. At the top she paused, looked back. Stood exactly where she'd left him. One hand on the bag at his side, the other hanging loose, fingers curling into a fist. No audience, no applause, just him. She let the moment settle, burned it into memory. Then she turned, stepped into the plane, and was gone. Inside, the air was cooler. The engines vibrated under her boots. She slid into her seat, buckled the harness, and pulled the old photograph from her jacket. The one with her first team, faces blurred by snow and distance. On the back, the words she had written long ago. Honor lives in silence, keep walking. Her fingers traced the letters. Her chest ached, but not from sorrow, from truth. The engines roared. The plane shook, rising into the sky. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and let herself feel something rare. Not pride, not relief. Peace. Quiet, heavy, real. The kind of peace that doesn't need recognition. The kind that doesn't need applause. The kind that comes from knowing you chose silence again and again, even when it cost you everything. Below, watched the plane lift, dust rising in its wake. His hands stayed clenched at his sides. His chest burned with words unsaid, questions unanswered. But in that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. Her strength had never been about what people saw. It had never been about medals, uniforms, or titles. It had been about silence, about sacrifice, about showing up when no one else would. And for the first time in his life, he felt small, not in weakness but in humility. Because he realized her shadow had been the ground he'd always walked on. The plane shrank into the horizon, swallowed by light. Stood alone, but not empty. Because now he carried her silence with him. And silence, he understood, could be louder than any applause. The story closes not with a shout, not with victory, not with recognition, but with a truth carried quietly, like a compass needle pointing forward. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.